On a peaceful morning at Rosie's diner, a man in a wheelchair quietly served, only to face mockery and shame before a silent crowd. But when the insults crossed the line, a secret call shook the entire town. 30 minutes later, 3 Marines stepped inside, bringing a lesson no one would forget. What happened? Listen to a story of honor, loyalty, and the strength of those who never bow. Under the soft morning sun in the outskirts of Willow Creek, Indiana, ancient oaks cast cool shadows over the narrow road to Rosie's Diner, a small eatery with a weathered wooden front. Sparrows chirped, their song blending with the steady hum of wheelchair tires on the gravel path. Thomas Riley, a 62-year-old man, guided his chair toward the diner. His faded blue shirt, though old, was neatly pressed, clinging to a frame still marked by a Marine's strength. On his chest, a small silver pin engraved with the USMC emblem gleamed in the sunlight, a quiet declaration of his past. His cap sat slightly askew, shading his thinning silver hair, but it couldn't hide his deep eyes, where memories of Desert Storm still smoldered. Thomas had lost a leg in that war, a wound that stole not just flesh, but left sleepless nights in its wake. Yet, he refused to let it define him. Every morning, he came to Rosie's Diner not for money, but to feel useful, to stay part of a moving world. The diner, with its scent of fresh coffee and the clink of dishes, was his haven of peace. He served wiped tables, handed out menus, and sometimes chatted with familiar faces. Though quiet, he was always tidy, worked hard, and never let a smile slip from his face, even if it carried the weight of time. Today, like always. He pushed through the glass door, his wheels gliding smoothly on the wooden floor. Jenny, the young waitress, waved, "Morning, Mr. Thomas." He nodded, his voice warm, steady. "Morning, Jenny. Busy today." He rolled to his usual corner, pulled a cloth from his pocket, and began wiping a table by the window. The diner's truckers on a break, families enjoying a weekend breakfast knew his presence. Some smiled, some nodded, but few realized the man in the wheelchair had once led men through scorching deserts, faced death, and sacrificed part of his body so others could live. Thomas didn't share those stories. He wiped tables, arranged silverware, and softly hummed an old tune as if whispering to days long gone. No one in Rosie's Diner, not even Thomas himself, could have guessed that this ordinary morning was about to become a day etched into the town's memory. Noon sunlight streamed through Rosie's Diner's windows, casting long rays across the wooden floor. Thomas Riley quietly wheeled between tables, handing out menus with a gentle smile. The small diner buzzed with chatter, the clink of dishes, and the warm scent of toasted bread. Thomas, his USMC pin glinting on his chest, moved deftly in his wheelchair, his strong hands guiding the wheels like an extension of himself. He'd just wiped a table near the counter, his old cloth gliding over the wood, when the diner's door swung open. 3 men strutted in, dressed in garish floral shirts, gold chains dangling, their loud voices echoing through the room. They claimed a corner table, propping their feet on chairs, laughing boisterously as if to stake their presence. Other diners glanced over, then quickly looked away, avoiding trouble. Thomas, unfazed by the disruption, wheeled to their table, neatly placing 3 menus down. "Morning, gentlemen. What can I get you today?" His voice was warm and polite, but one of the men, with bleached blonde hair, leaned back, eyeing Thomas from head to toe, a smirk curling his lips. "See, if you had a decent kid, you wouldn't be stuck cleaning tables at your age." His laugh cut sharp, stinging. A few nearby diners paused mid-bite, their eyes flicking over, then dropping. Another man, wearing sunglasses indoors, chimed in, his tone mocking. "Bet your kid ditched you. Who lets their dad wheel around wiping tables?" The trio erupted in laughter as if they had cracked a brilliant joke. The diner's air grew heavy. Whispers faded, but no one spoke up. Jenny, the waitress, stood behind the counter, clutching a rag, her eyes darting to Thomas with worry. Carl, the manager, lingered in a far corner, pretending to fuss with paperwork. Thomas didn't reply. His deep eyes flickered, but his face stayed calm, as if the insults were just a breeze passing through the scorching deserts he had once faced. He quietly wheeled away, tending to his work, delivering a glass of water to another table. But inside, memories of Desert Storm stirred days when he'd pulled comrades through gunfire, not with anger, but with a quiet sorrow. Those taunts didn't just strike him, they struck the sacrifices he'd carried. The diners, though they heard every word, stayed silent, their gazes averted as if speaking up might invite trouble. But at a nearby table, a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair watched Thomas, his eyes a mix of curiosity and sadness. He turned to his father, a middle-aged man in a worn USMC logo cap, and whispered, "Dad, why are they saying that to him?" The father didn't answer right away. His hand tightened around his coffee mug, his eyes sharpening as if a decision was taking shape. The air in Rosie's diner turned stifling as if the three men's taunts had drained the warmth from the small eatery. Their sharp laughter echoed, piercing, while other diners bowed their heads, pretending to focus on their plates or coffee, avoiding the injustice unfolding. Thomas Riley, in his wheelchair, kept working, his strong hands guiding the wheels with the precision of a man who'd once led comrades through blazing deserts. The USMC pin on his chest glinted in the noon sunlight, but his deep, steady eyes seemed untouched by the insults. He wheeled to another table, set down his cloth, and began arranging silverware as if nothing had happened. But the three men in the corner weren't done. The blond one, smirking, stood and sauntered over, giving Thomas's wheelchair a light shove, just enough to make it wobble. "Hurry up, old man, or we'll have your boss fire you." His voice dripped with glee like he was playing a cruel game. Nearby diners looked up, their eyes flicking over, then darting away, unwilling to get involved. Jenny, the waitress, stood behind the counter, biting her lip, her hands clutching a rag, too scared to speak. Carl, the manager, lingered in a far corner, fussing with receipts as if deaf to the scene. Thomas paused, his hands briefly tightening on the table's edge, but he said nothing. He wheeled toward the counter for a fresh cloth when the second man, in sunglasses, deliberately dropped a spoon to the floor. "Oops, sorry. Pick that up for us. Will you?" He laughed. "Owd," the other two joining in. "Bet he's working 'cause no one's taking care of him. Real men retire and get looked after." Their laughter cut like a knife, thickening the diner's heavy air. Thomas leaned down, picking up the spoon with slow, deliberate care. His face unmoved, but inside, memories of Desert Storm surged not with anger, but with deep sorrow, the pain of a man who'd given everything, now reduced to a joke. At a nearby table, the 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair clenched his fists, his eyes shifting from sadness to anger. He turned to his father, a rugged middle-aged man in a worn USMC logo cap, whispering urgently, "Dad, they can't do that to him." The father, his face weathered, set his coffee down, his eyes sharpening, a fire sparking within. He patted his son's shoulder, his voice low, firm. "Stay here, Tommy. Finish your breakfast. I've got a quick call to make." The boy nodded, but his gaze stayed locked on Thomas, as if to say he understood. He saw the wrong. Thomas, seemingly unaware of the boy's stare, kept wiping the table, his old cloth gliding over the wood, but his hands trembled slightly not from fear, but from an invisible line that had just been crossed. The silence in Rosie's diner grew heavy, like a storm ready to break. The three men's taunts lingered in the air, invisible knives slicing into those who witnessed. Yet none dared speak. Thomas Riley, in his wheelchair, kept working, his strong hands guiding the wheels with the precision of a man who'd led comrades through Desert Storm's fierce battles. The USMC pin on his chest gleamed in the noon sunlight, but his face remained steady as if the insults were mere dust in the deserts he'd crossed. He wheeled to the counter, exchanged a few words with Jenny, then returned to wiping a table by the window, his old cloth gliding over the wood, each motion marked by a soldier's patience. But at a nearby table, 10-year-old Tommy clenched his fists, his eyes fixed on Thomas, as if to say he understood the wrong unfolding. His father, John Harper, a former Marine with a worn USMC logo cap, stood up, his gaze icy. A decision made? He patted his son's shoulder, his voice low, firm. "Tommy, stay here and eat. I've got a quick call to make." The boy nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on Thomas as if waiting for something monumental. Harper strode out, his old boots thudding on the wooden floor, disappearing through the glass door to his pickup truck outside. Under the oak's shade, he pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number, his voice grave, unwavering. "Riley here. Need a special? Off the books. One of ours is being disrespected." On the other end, a steady voice replied. "No questions asked, only confirmation. Understood. 30 minutes. Harper pocketed the phone, his eyes fixed on Rosie's diner, where Thomas kept working, unaware of the tidal wave coming. Inside, the three men laughed louder, their voices booming as if Thomas's silence was their victory. The blonde one smirked, calling out, "Hey, old man, bring more coffee, or is your wheelchair out of juice?" Their laughter rang again, but this time, a few diners shook their heads, their eyes betraying unease, though none spoke up. Jenny, behind the counter, bit her lip, her gaze flickering to Thomas as if apologizing for her helplessness. Carl, the manager, hovered in a far corner, fussing with the cash register, but sweat beaded on his brow, betraying his sense that things had gone too far. Thomas, seemingly deaf to the jeers, kept wiping the table, his old cloth gliding over the wood, but a glint in his deep eyes sparked not anger, but resolve, as if he knew his honor needed no words to prove. No one in Rosie's diner, not even the three men, could have guessed that Harper's call had just set in motion a chain of events that would change the small diner's air forever. The air in Rosie's diner hung heavy, as if time itself had slowed, pressing down on the shoulders of diners witnessing the insults hurled at Thomas Riley. The three men in the corner kept laughing, their voices booming with smug triumph, as if Thomas's silence proved their victory. Thomas, in his wheelchair, worked on, his strong hands guiding the wheels with the precision of a man who'd led comrades through Desert Storm's scorching sands. The USMC pin on his chest gleamed in the noon sunlight, but his deep, calm eyes seemed to brush off the taunts like dust in the wind. He wheeled to a table near the door, wiping the wood with his old cloth, his movements slow, patient, like the way he'd endured war's long nights. Young Tommy, at a nearby table, clenched his fists, his eyes locked on Thomas as if waiting for something to change everything. Other diners bowed their heads, their gazes averted, their silence a wall around the injustice. Jenny, the waitress, stood behind the counter, biting her lip, her eyes filled with worry, too afraid to speak. Carl, the manager, lingered in a far corner, fussing with paperwork, but sweat on his brow betrayed his sense that things had gone too far. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed from outside, the growl of a military machine. Heads turned, eyes fixed on the large glass door. A sleek black military SUV pulled up outside Rosie's diner, followed by a Humvee bearing the Marine Corps flag. The SUV's door swung open, and three commanding figures stepped out. Leading was Master Gunnery Sergeant James Hawk Bell, an older man with a rugged stride, his weathered face etched with years of combat. Behind him was Captain Maria Cortez, a sharp-eyed female officer, and Sergeant David Kane, muscular, standing like a steel pillar. Their crisp uniforms bore no visible weapons, but their presence alone froze the air. Diners stopped eating, forks hovering mid-air. The three men in the corner fell silent, their eyes flickering with unease, their earlier bravado gone. John Harper, who'd made the call, stood outside, his gaze quietly watching. James Bell led the way, stepping through the glass door, his boots thudding firmly on the wooden floor. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, then settling on Thomas, wiping a table by the window. Without a word, James stood at attention, raising a slow, solemn Marine Corps salute as if honoring a high-ranking officer. Maria and David flanked him, saluting, too, their eyes brimming with respect. Thomas paused and looked up, his gaze meeting James's, and, at that moment, an invisible bond formed, two soldiers, decades apart, connected by the language of honor. The diner fell utterly silent. Not a sound save the ticking of the wall clock. Young Tommy's eyes shone, his hand gripping his father's as if witnessing a miracle. No one in Rosie's diner, not even the three men, could have imagined this familiar space was about to become the stage for a lesson none would forget. The air in Rosie's diner froze, as if the world itself held its breath before the presence of three Marines. Master Gunnery Sergeant James Hawk Bell stood before Thomas Riley, his sharp eyes filled with reverence as if gazing at a living emblem of courage. Captain Maria Cortez and Sergeant David Kane flanked him, their postures rigid as steel, their gazes fixed on Thomas, guarding a priceless legacy. Thomas, in his wheelchair, lifted his head, his deep eyes meeting James's, and an invisible bond spread, like two soldiers understanding each other through silent sacrifices. Diners from truckers to families sat still, forks suspended midair, their eyes glued to the solemn scene. The three men in the corner, once loud with mockery, shrank back, their glances darting, their earlier bravado melting like mist under the Oon sun. Young Tommy, at a nearby table, gripped his father's hand, his eyes blazing as if witnessing a lesson beyond any book. James Bell stepped forward, his voice low, resonant, yet shaking the diner to its core. Who told this man to go home because he has no kids? No one answered. The blond man bowed his head, shrinking in his seat. The one in sunglasses glanced at his friends, and the third clutched his coffee cup as if wishing to vanish from James's gaze. Their silence was a confession. James turned to Thomas, his voice softening yet heavy with history. He doesn't need kids to care for him because he kept an entire unit alive in war. He pulled me from gunfire in Desert Store when I thought I'd never see the sun again. Every man in our unit owes him a life. The crowd stirred, their eyes shifting from James to Thomas as if seeing the man in the wheelchair for the first time, not just a server, but a hero. Captain Maria Cortez stepped up, her voice clear, unwavering, yet laced with raw emotion. This man saved my life in Iraq. When my vehicle hit a mine, he, though retired, had trained me to stay calm, to survive. No one gets to shame a man like him. No one. Her words rang out, a declaration, making some diners lower their heads, ashamed of their silence. Jenny, the waitress behind the counter, wiped tears, her eyes brimming with pride. Carl, the manager, stepped from his corner, his face flushed as if realizing his mistake in letting things go too far. James faced the three men again, his eyes not angry, but heavy with disappointment. When you mocked him, you didn't just insult a soldier. You insulted everything we fight for: honor, sacrifice, loyalty. The three men couldn't meet his gaze, their eyes glued to the table as if longing to disappear. Young Tommy stood up, his eyes shining as if a fire had ignited within him. His father, John Harper, rested a hand on his shoulder, his gaze quiet but proud. Not a bullet was fired, not a fist raised, but the lesson James, Maria, and David brought to Rosie's diner that day cut sharper than any weapon. Thomas, still in his wheelchair, gave a slight nod, his eyes free of triumph, only a distant sadness, as if he'd long grown used to a world that forgot his deeds. But today, at least, his honor was restored not by words, but by the presence of soldiers who had once fought beside him. The silence in Rosie's diner had shifted, no longer born of apathy or fear, but profound respect. As if the very space bowed before the story just told, Master Gunnery Sergeant James Hawk Bell stood before Thomas Riley, his steady gaze now tinged with pride. Captain Maria Cortez and Sergeant David Kane flanked him, their postures like steel pillars, their eyes fixed on Thomas, guarding not just him, but the legacy of all who'd served. Thomas, in his wheelchair, raised his head, a faint glint in his deep eyes not of victory, but of the quiet calm of a man whose honor was restored by deeds, not words. Diners from truckers to families sat still, their gazes shifting from the three Marines to Thomas, as if seeing him for the first time, not as a server, but as a hero. The three men in the corner, once loud with mockery, slumped low, their eyes glued to the table, their bravado gone, shame plain on their faces. Young Tommy, at a nearby table, stood up, his eyes blazing as if a fire had sparked within. His father, John Harper, rested a hand on his shoulder, his gaze quiet but proud. James Bell approached Thomas's table, pulling a small metal tag engraved with the Marine Corps emblem from his pocket and placing it on the wooden surface with solemn care. His voice, low and clear, rang like a proclamation. From this day, anyone who served will always be served here with respect. Let no one forget that. His words struck like a hammer, shattering any doubt, any indifference that lingered in the diner. The crowd nodded softly, some wiping tears, feeling the weight of the story shared. Jenny, the waitress behind the counter, smiled, her eyes shining with pride, as if rediscovering faith in the place she worked. Carl, the manager, stepped forward from his corner, his face flushed, his voice trembling. "Mr. Riley, we're sorry. We were wrong to let this happen." Thomas only nodded, his eyes free of anger. Only that distant sadness, as if used to a world that overlooked his sacrifices. Young Tommy, unable to hold back, left his table and approached Thomas, standing tall and raising a clumsy but earnest military salute, like one he'd seen in movies. Thomas looked at him, a genuine, warm smile breaking through for the first time that morning. "Thank you." "Son," he said, his voice low, like a teacher's praise. John Harper, Tommy's father, stepped forward, his eyes meeting Thomas's, and spoke, his voice steady, firm. "My boy just learned something no school could teach, how to stand tall against wrong, and how to honor those who've sacrificed." The crowd, as if awakened, rose to their feet, silent, their actions a quiet vow. The three men slipped out of the diner, heads bowed, not daring to look back. James, Maria, and David stood still, their gazes following Thomas as if to say he was never alone. Thomas wheeled to the counter, resuming his work, his old cloth gliding over the wood. But now, each motion carried new meaning, a reminder that honor needs no gunfire to be reclaimed, only soldiers who know when to stand. As the noon sun softened, Rosie's diner returned to its daily rhythm, but the small eatery now carried a different air, as if Thomas Riley's story had kindled a quiet flame in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Thomas, in his wheelchair, kept working, his strong hands guiding the wheels with the precision of a former Marine who'd led men through Desert Storm's blazing sands. The USMC pin on his chest gleamed, no longer just a decoration, but a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice, now seen with newfound respect by all in the diner. Master Gunnery Sergeant James Hawk Bell, Captain Maria Cortez, and Sergeant David Kane had left, but their presence left an indelible lesson. Diners from truckers to families began talking again, their voices softer, as if reluctant to disturb the sacred moment just past. Young Tommy, at a nearby table, still watched Thomas, his eyes shining as if he'd found a true hero. His father, John Harper, smiled, a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze filled with pride, knowing his boy had learned something more precious than any lecture. Jenny, the waitress behind the counter, quietly wiped tears, her eyes following Thomas with newfound admiration. Carl, the manager, stepped forward from his corner, approaching Thomas, his voice trembling. "Mr. Riley, from now on, anyone who served will be treated right here." Thomas nodded, his eyes free of anger, only a faint smile as if used to a world needing reminders of his deeds. A week later, a small plaque was mounted on the diner's wooden wall, side from Table 4, where Thomas often worked. It read, "Table 4, reserved for those who served, and never need to prove it." The modest plaque, each word carved deep, struck the hearts of all who read it. Thomas still came every morning, wheeling between tables, wiping surfaces with his old cloth. But now, no one dared look down on him. Diners, from strangers to regulars, greeted him with respectful nods, some pausing to ask about stories he rarely shared. One morning, Tommy returned with his father, approaching Thomas's table, his eyes earnest. "Did you really fight in a war?" Sir Thomas smiled, his voice warm, steady. "I did, son. But what I'm proudest of isn't holding a gun. It's living a life worth looking up to for kids like you. Thomas's story spread beyond Rosie's diner into Willow Creek's homes and schools, where teachers began inviting veterans to speak. A program linking young veterans with men like Thomas took root, ensuring lessons of honor and sacrifice would never fade. Thomas remained quiet, still doing his work, but to those who'd seen, he was no mere server. He was the man who taught them to stand tall, to see a person's true worth, and to preserve the silent legacy of soldiers. As the noon sun faded from Rosie's diner, Thomas Riley's story lingered, a reminder that honor needs no gunfire to shine. A man in a wheelchair who once saved lives in Desert Storm taught an entire town to stand tall against injustice. From young Tommy to the Marines, they together restored a silent legacy, ensuring no veteran is forgotten. If this story touches your heart, share it with friends and family to spread the flame of loyalty. And don't forget to subscribe to the Silent Valor Stories YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join us in keeping stories like Thomas's alive forever.